It's summertime in college football, which naturally means we're talking about conference expansion. But maybe there's another type of realignment we should consider for the future. Maybe conference contraction could be a thing down the road, and I'm not the only one that thinks that. Would the Big Ten consider removing teams from the conference in the future? If so, which teams would be on the chopping block? Before we get into that, just a reminder to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Big Ten content all offseason long. Always crush that like button to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses. Joel Klatt recently mentioned on his show, on his podcast, possibly conference contraction could be a way to increase the media value, to keep the media value. Because as he said, there's eventually going to be a ceiling in terms of these media companies. Eventually, if we continue to add more and more and more teams in conference expansion, the media value and the monetary value that these media companies are willing to spend on college athletics might catch up. And eventually, how do you keep increasing the yearly payout for a conference? You trim the fat. You cut the teams that maybe dilute the schedule and dilute the product a little bit. And there are consequences to that, which I'm going to get into in the future. Because these networks, right? You talk about the NFL, you talk about the NBA and Major League Baseball. Those professional sports contracts are going to continue escalating as well, especially the NFL, right? They're adding regular season games. Now they're putting games on Black Friday. They're putting games on Christmas. They've been on Thanksgiving forever. Like, the NFL is flat out taking over, and they, Roger Goodell and the owners, are going to try to find ways to increase the revenue. Media companies are going to have to pay for that. So eventually college sports is going to be a tier or a couple of tiers below professional sports, and there's going to be a ceiling eventually for what can be paid, especially if conferences keep expanding and you have to distribute the revenue evenly. I'm going to talk about some of the consequences first. Let's talk about this, right? You throw in, especially for the Big Ten, you throw in a conference where maybe you have the best 12 teams not in the Southeast. You're going to have an extremely difficult schedule. It's going to be a conference that's focused on football. Other sports are going to take already more of a backseat than it has already taken, like a potential conference of Notre Dame, of Wisconsin, Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, USC, Oregon, UCLA. Who are some of the bottom feeders? Instead of your bottom feeders being Indiana and Northwestern and Rutgers, now your bottom feeders are Nebraska, they're Iowa, UCLA, Minnesota, Michigan State, maybe some of those teams. So the expectations are a little bit different. So if you want to talk about if the Big Ten wants to do this or not, I don't think any conference wants to do this. I don't think they said, yeah, we want to cut teams. No, that doesn't want to happen, but university presidents and athletic directors want to see their budgets increase. They want to bring in more money, and eventually, like I said, there's going to be a cap. There's going to be a limit. These media companies don't have an unlimited budget, although it may seem like that sometimes. I mentioned before, the professional sports. Eventually, there's going to be a ceiling that is going to be hit, and the only way to keep increasing the revenue is either get really, really, really creative or contraction. You look at that potential 12-team conference that I threw out, and now Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa are your bottom feeders. I don't think that's good for the sport. I don't think that's good for the Big Ten. I don't really think that's good for anybody. So I'm going to say this right now on the record. I hate contraction. I hate the idea that all of a sudden to increase the media value, we're so centric on the media value, on increasing the monetary payouts, that we're willing to cut 100-year ties with Purdue, with Indiana, with Northwestern, and schools like that. I just don't, where do we draw the line with money in college athletics? I think we're going to find that out really soon. I just don't know where it is. The ability, I think when you cross that line of getting rid of teams, you cross a whole new line in college sports. It's a lot like making student athletes employees that I mentioned last week. It's something that you need to be prepared for, and there are going to be consequences of that. I think there's something to be said about depth in a conference. I think there's something to be said about Ohio State and Michigan, Penn State at the top, teams in the mid-tier, teams in the bottom tier trying to work their way up through the conference. Right, when we added Rutgers, when the Big Ten added Rutgers, yeah, they're not the most competitive on the football field, but they added things in other areas. And I think that's one thing that I want to talk about as well. Because if you just assemble the 12, the 14 best football schools outside of the Southeast, now you're a football conference that just so happens to play a bunch of other sports. I think throughout these past realignment moves, yes, football has driven a lot of the bus, and it will continue to drive the Big Ten bus forward. But we need to at least create the illusion that other things exist in the world of Big Ten expansion, in the world of Big Ten media rights. I know basketball is a thing as well. They are that sport that is behind football. It's a pretty decent gap, but we need to at least create the notion, create maybe the illusion that it's not just a football conference, that there's other things involved here as well when you talk about these moves. Now, to avoid contraction, I think the Big Ten and other conferences, but I'm only focused on the Big Ten here, the Big Ten needs to be careful and strategic with their expansion moves. I've talked about it ad nauseum on this channel throughout the summer. You can't just add teams just to add teams. USC and UCLA were great additions for a variety of reasons. You bring in two blue bloods in two different sports, basketball and football, right? You bring in Los Angeles and the West Coast and everything that involves. That was a big time move, a big time expansion move for the Big Ten Conference. So we've been talking about further West Coast expansion. I talked about Stanford and Cal on the live stream on Wednesday. Although they bring so much in terms of academics, they bring so much in terms of research, you got to look 20, 30 years down the line. Oh, we added Stanford and Cal in 2024, but now we get to 2035 and 2040, and all of a sudden they haven't put their effort forth in really making themselves a better football program. They just aren't great on the football field. They don't drive that value from a media perspective, and now maybe drives our media value down a little bit where we got to distribute evenly to schools like a Stanford and Cal. The Big Ten, as they expand further, need to be strategic and they need to be careful. Have an eye on the East and have an eye on the future so you can continue to increase your television revenue as you go. I've been a proponent of adding teams on the West Coast if it adds to the value of the current teams in the Big Ten. If you add teams and they get their reduced share and then the 16 schools in the Big Ten, it remains the same, I don't think that's a strong move for the Big Ten. You need to continue to increase the value every time you add teams, period. Now, if we want to go into a world where contraction is a thing and where we're talking about contraction, right? If Notre Dame is on the table and if Notre Dame finds their way to the Big Ten Conference, now you got 3 teams in the state of Indiana. The Big Ten is eventually going to say, do we really need 3 teams in Indiana? They're going to go through each state, right? They're not going to want to spread themselves too thin in a particular state, right? They're going to go to the state of Illinois. Do we need 2 schools in the state of Illinois, or can Illinois carry the state by itself? I know Rutgers was originally added because getting out to New York City, getting out to the market, expanding cable subscribers in that area with the Big Ten Network. Now that the media landscape is changing a little bit, where does Rutgers stand? I think you look at Rutgers, you look at Indiana and Purdue, you look at Northwestern. Those are the type of schools that you're looking at when you look at contraction. And I would just hate these long-term relationships, especially with Indiana, Purdue, and Northwestern. I would hate us be so invested in the financial part of this sport that we see teams kicked out of a conference. I would rather see careful and strategic expansion as we go forth. The Big Ten, said it many times on this channel, is in a position of power. The Big Ten is great right now, sitting at 16 teams. If you can find added value for your current members by bringing in Oregon and Washington, maybe a Stanford and Cal eventually, great. But if the value doesn't increase a significant amount, you might not want to do it because you got to keep an eye on the future as you continue going down the line. I would just hate to see this league become so money-centric and so football-centric that we're making these types of moves, that we're making this type of situation a reality. Contraction, unequal revenue distribution, I don't want it. I don't think anybody wants it. I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think contraction could be a thing of the future for the Big Ten Conference? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.